The Israeli Knesset reconvenes while massive protests continue across the country. As consultations over controversial legislation struggle, can Netanyahu push ahead with his judicial reforms? Or could 4 months of anti-government protests stop the changes and potentially bring the government down? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Israel's judicial reforms. Tens of thousands of Israelis protested on Saturday for a 17th week ahead of today's reopening of the Knesset. They're still fiercely in opposition of the government's proposed judicial reforms, which remain on pause. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's nationalist religious government says the changes are needed to rein in what he calls activist judges. But after massive opposition, they agreed last month to halt the plans and allow for more consultation. For many Israelis, the standoff has opened up profound questions that go beyond the makeup of the Supreme Court and the would-be power of the executive to override its decisions. Critics now see the government's moves as an existential threat to their democracy.
It's clear to us today that we are the majority, and that helps us. There's no left or right here. This is a fight for democracy and a liberal majority. When I come here every week, it's clear that our people are strong people.
I'm worried that soon there will be no democracy left here, that soon the government will become an autocratic government, and that undemocratic laws will be passed here.
The majority is 64, and they think that they want to go their way, but they still have to keep the democracy.
So under that pressure from protesters, the legislation was put on hold. But as the Knesset reconvenes, what will come of those proposed judicial reforms? Well, joining me now to debate that are from Mannheim, Germany, Danny Ayalon. He is the founder of The Truth About Israel and Israel's former deputy foreign minister. And from Tel Aviv is Neri Zilber, a journalist and adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute. Thanks both so much for being with me. Danny, I'll begin with you. You know, the process of passing these reforms, it's been paused pending the consultations, but the Labor Party has withdrawn from negotiations. There's been zero mention of progress in any talks that we've heard so far. So the protests continue. What are the potential outcomes here, and what do you think will or should happen?
Well, thank you. First of all, I would say that theoretically there should be two outcomes. One is that there is some agreement with a wide consensus, and by that there will be some kind of legislation, a watered-down judicial reform that everybody can live with and agree, and the end of protests. This is one outcome. The second one, which at this point I'm afraid is more likely, is that there will not be a consensus. As you mentioned, you're right, the Labor is out, but still the two major opposition parties are in with the negotiations. But at this point, it seems like a stalemate, and mostly there is no trust. Because of no trust, we see that even during the negotiations, we see the demonstrations that continue unabated week after week after week. The pro-reform, which is the coalition and the government, they came out with a show of force last Thursday in Jerusalem. But at the end of the day, the momentum is with those who are against the reforms. And I believe that even if we do not find a consensus, the Prime Minister will most likely put it on a hold, creating problems within his own party and within his own coalition. But I don't think he has any other chance to proceed.
Let me ask Neri, I mean, do you hold out much hope for these consultations and negotiations to actually produce any results that both sides could actually agree to?
No, I'm quite skeptical that anything will come of the negotiations, of the talks, for the simple reason that the anti-government and anti-judicial overhaul side can't really compromise on Israeli democracy. You can't have half a dictatorship and half a democracy. And so, yes, in theory, there is potential for a deal to be had so long as the government side and the people pushing and that have pushed the judicial overhaul from the very beginning are willing to actually come down from the very high tree that they've climbed up on and agree to some form of reform that does not hand them unchecked power. Now, in theory, that's possible, but in actual practice, this would likely undermine the reason for being that they proposed this radical agenda in the first place.
Right. There is this feeling, though, Neri, that, with so much time passing, I mean, this has been 4 months of protests now, that Netanyahu and his coalition could, in a sense, be just trying to kind of wear people down, wait it out, to at least get part of what they want kind of pushed through for the sake of just getting something done. Is that possible? Is there a strategy behind letting so much time pass?
No, I think number one, the issue of time was forced upon this government and on Prime Minister Netanyahu for the simple reason that he had a nationwide revolt and general strike on his hands about a month ago. So he wanted something very different to transpire in the first 3 or so months of this new government that he was helming. So he was forced into this position, into essentially buying time, like you said. And yes, the reason for the protests continuing is precisely the fact that they don't trust Netanyahu or this government to actually keep their word and to actually come and really compromise and back down from the radical agenda that they proposed. So that's the simple reason why protests are ongoing, and they will continue, as it were, until this legislation is taken off the table. And Netanyahu, I think, really knows the fact that if he tries to seek through parliament under cover of night, then he will have a similar repeat event that he had a month ago, which is hundreds of thousands of Israelis spontaneously taking to the streets to force him to back down once again. So he's very aware of this, and hence the dilemma. And like Danny said, it'll come likely down to a choice between the good of the country and the unity of the country and the unity of Netanyahu's coalition. I don't think that he has concluded in his mind which way he wants to take it.
Okay. Danny, there were also, though, protests in support of Netanyahu and these changes. How representative are they of the overall population, do you think, right now?
Not much, I think. You see, there is a big difference between the pro-reform, like those who came out in Jerusalem Thursday, and those who are against. The pro-reforms is very well organized, top-down, by government, and even if you see, there is a, let's say, some debate how many were there, 100,000 or 200,000, but this is really doesn't really matter because they were all, I would say, of one political party mostly, not even Likud. They were to the right of Likud, those Smotrich and Ben-Gvir governments, the settlers governments, and they very well organized, financed. On the other hand, we see that the anti-reform, it's all very spontaneous. It's, it's like bottom up. No one had to organize. People are coming out to the streets. Some would say that this is the finest time for Israeli democracy, where the people, are very concerned and are very active and very caring about which way their country is going. And this brings me back to the fact that they have the momentum. The anti-government spirit and those who are against the reforms have the momentum, where the government, I'm not sure that they can bring another 100,000 or more like they did last Thursday. They will. They don't have the stamina for that. Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, is in a bind. I think he is in a no-win. He's in a lose-lose situation politically. The country may benefit out of it.
Neri, there was on another track here as well that I need to address with both of you. There was some controversy as well a few days ago over Spain's prime minister actually expressing support for the anti-government protesters. Tell me at this time how much you think it means for people on the streets to hear leaders backing them from abroad.
Well, it means a great deal, and with all due respect to Spain and the Spanish Prime Minister, that was an interesting wrinkle this past weekend at the anti-government demonstration in Tel Aviv, and that caused a lot of strain in Israel-Spain relations, especially since it came right after the Israeli foreign minister had visited Madrid. So that was just an interesting wrinkle. But really, the main focus of protesters on the streets against the government is the approach of the U.S. and the Biden administration. And for them, they're actually quite grateful and quite thankful that the Biden himself, the president, and his administration have taken a very hard line on this issue. That goes a long way, both on the streets and at the highest levels of the Israeli government. It causes Prime Minister Netanyahu a lot of political heartache at home when ties are strained between Israel and its closest ally, the United States.
Quickly, though, Neri, on that, what are they saying about, what are you hearing about Kevin McCarthy's line, the Speaker of the House, on the protests?
Well, it's not a surprise to hear a senior Republican actually take a very different approach and essentially criticize the Democrats and the Biden administration for criticizing Israel and delving into what McCarthy said was an internal Israeli matter. Yes, it's a show of force or a show of strength by the Republicans for a Netanyahu government. That comes as no surprise to the Israeli public, that Israel itself has become a partisan issue in Washington. This is now going on now for a decade plus. And the Prime Minister himself of Israel bears a lot of responsibility for making Israel a partisan issue in Washington.
And Danny, I mean, as a former government official yourself, what do you make of, any foreign leader really making the kinds of comments that the Spanish Prime Minister did? We have to remember, though, he wasn't necessarily making those comments. In fact, he wasn't making those comments in his capacity as Prime Minister. It was as head of the President of Socialist International, which sounds more appropriate, but he is still Prime Minister. But what do you make of that as a former government official yourself, hearing that kind of what some would call, almost an intervention type line?
Yeah. No, it's quite interesting. I think we have stepped into a new political era or a new diplomatic era where domestic issues are intertwined with foreign policy. It's not just between Israel and the United States. You see it all over. You see it in Europe. You see it in Asia. Everywhere now the line has been blurred. Now, when it comes to Israel and the United States, certainly the Israelis do like their leaders to be in good terms, very good terms, with the American administration and with the American Congress. Right now, Netanyahu, which used to be Mr. America, he was educated in America. Supposedly, he knows very well the American DNA. And the fact that now there is such a rift where President Biden will not even see him, I think this really is very taxing on Netanyahu politically. And this is why I believe he cannot afford going with the reform full force if the negotiations break down.
Danny Ayalon, Neri Zilber, we will have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you both so much for being with us on this segment of The Newsmakers. Now, the protests have caused major disruptions across Israel for months now, but there is one demographic that's had much less involvement. About 20% of Israel's population is Palestinian Israeli. They are officially citizens of Israel, but many identify as Palestinian. Now, some feel opposition to the judicial reforms has been unjustly prioritized over issues concerning the basic rights of Palestinian Israelis. They've decided to boycott the anti-government protests altogether. But another group of Palestinian Israelis is encouraging ever greater participation in these protests.
Democracy within Israel isn't perfect. It has flaws. In our Arab society, we sometimes wonder if it can be defined as a democracy. The courts in Israel haven't always sided with justice and weren't always on the right side of history. But despite that, I ask you, if something is flawed, do you further flaw it? What is better, to try to fix a flawed democracy or to race towards a perfect dictatorship?
Well, some strong points made there, so let's debate. Palestinian-Israeli participation in the protests, as well as the country's elections. And joining me now from Tel Aviv is the protester you just saw there, political activist Ibrahim Abu Ahmad. And from Jaffa, Israel, is Sami Abu Shehadeh, a historian and former member of the Knesset for the Balad party in the joint list. Thanks so much for being with me, both of you. Ibrahim, I want to pick up first on what you said there regarding your participation in these protests. You asked, do you try to fix a flawed democracy or do you race towards the perfect dictatorship? Essentially, you don't want to see bad go to worse, but others argue that you are only emboldening an apartheid state by legitimizing a democracy that's only really built for its Jewish population.
I mean, first of all, I'm not trying to legitimize a false democracy. The first thing that I said, and I think it was important, The fact that we participate in these protests is an opportunity to bring our voice. If I wasn't there, nobody would hear the sentence that our community does not see Israel as a real democracy. People needed to hear it, and I was there to put it on the main stage, no less. And I'm also not advocating to come back to the old rule. But in order for us to put our statement out there that we need to make real changes and that the democracy in Israel is not a complete democracy, we need to make our stance also when we are in this crisis. There is a large number of Israelis, and the numbers are increasing, that are an ally and a potential ally to change the status quo, to change this reality. After the burnings and the horrors that we saw in Hawara, the number of Israeli protesters increased. When I spoke, the number of Israelis that asked, where are the Arab community? And we want you there with us increased. When we get this part of the Israeli society to finally listen, and they're finally actually realizing what we've been always talking about, the police's brutality, when they faced the violence of the police, then they started to say, we finally know what you're talking about in the Arab community. This part of the Israeli society, if we can get them on our side, if we come out and protest and we say, we will not allow this government, and particularly this government, headed by Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, the most right-wing government we've ever seen, are we gonna let this government have unprecedented power without making any statement? This is unacceptable.
Okay.
We need to stop this government of having this power, and at the same time, to make our point and make our stance, we're standing with the rest of the Israeli society against this government. But in return, when we stand together, you need to realize that there need to be made changes in order for us to be fully equal in this country. Otherwise, this is not enough. But we can't do it without trying. So that's why I'm doing it.
Right. Sami, I see you agree with most of the points that were made there. So why don't you encourage active participation in the same form?
I was listening, and I disagree with all the things that has been said. And it's great that Ibrahim thinks this way. Unfortunately, he is the only one in the demonstrators, or a very, very small, marginal, and unimportant minority within the protesters thinks in this way. If you check who are the demonstrators, who are the protesters, what are the serious political forces behind these protests, you would see that they are the Israeli opposition. Now, who are these Israeli opposition? You are talking about people like Lieberman, the man who made all these racist laws against us, or Gantz, who was killing, his main profession was killing our people for decades. This is why he is considered an important politician in his society. And if you hear the demands of the vast majority raising the Israeli flags in these protests, we as Palestinians, I say we are not part of these demands, and we are not part of this protest. This does not mean that we don't have any statement to say. This does not mean that we don't have anything to do. But we cannot be part of what is being done in Tel Aviv, because those who are leading all these protests in Tel Aviv, Simonta, are the same people who made all these catastrophes for the last 75 years.
Okay.
These are the old elites leading the Zionist project for the last 75 years. These are the people who are occupying our people.
Right.
These are the
we understand that, Sami, but I mean, we are where we are today, and I have to ask you this because you said before that Arab Palestinian Israelis have lost their trust in the system, and that is why, for example, they came out to vote last time in record low numbers, and now for the same reasons they're not participating in these protests. But tell me, what have they gotten out of their choice to not participate? The government has turned further to the right, and the judiciary also can turn further against them now because of that right-wing power that Palestinian Israelis did not take part in voting for.
We should be very aware not to continue blaming the victims, Simonta. The Israeli society has been deteriorating towards extreme fascism in the last 2 decades. We are not responsible for that. This is not our responsibility. Of course, it's our responsibility to bring a political agenda that could be helpful and could be promoting our interests for the whole community. And this is what we have been doing since mid-1990s. We have our own political agenda that we aim at changing Israel into a normal democracy, making it the state of all its citizens, a state which is built on justice and equality for all, Arabs and Jews alike. But unfortunately, with this political program, we don't have any serious part of the protesters being part of our political program, of our political demands, of our political agenda. Now, going for to feel good with yourself, going with all these people who have been oppressing you and your people for decades is politically something wrong to do. Now, this does not mean that we should not do something that will bring our voices much louder in Nazareth or in another place that we can pick as leadership altogether.
Okay.
But being part of the current protest is not promoting us to anywhere which we believe is good for our future.
Okay, Ibrahim, I can see you laughing. Go ahead.
I'm not laughing, but I've been. If we had protests in our own Arab cities, I would have been there. I would have spoken there, not in Tel Aviv. The political leadership, the Arab political leadership in general, has not made any protests. And in fact, in every place I've ever spoken, I talked about the need for us to have our own protests. I never talked about the fact that we need to join the masses of Israelis in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. We have our own statements against the government, our own statements against the judicial reforms. So we need to make our own protests. These protests have been happening for how many weeks now? 17, 16, I can't count anymore. But we haven't seen one proper Arab protest in our own communities. We have statements, we have grievances. Why haven't we put them out there? Me as a personal individual, I'm doing my own job and I'm speaking and advocating, but I can't move the masses. This is the role of political leadership, not myself. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that. And in order for me to advocate for my own people, the only place I was able to speak was in Tel Aviv, and I put, first of all, my identity out there for the rest of the Israeli society. We are Palestinian people. They need to accept this fact once and for all. They need to understand where our position is against the democracy and the state, and it needs to change. If we're not there, we can't bring these voices to hear us. And I think part of the issue also, when we talk about the fact that the protests are being held by the opposition, honestly, if we go down to the actual streets, I don't see Gantz himself or Lieberman. I see regular people. A lot of them disagree with us, by the way. But in order for them to realize what we're talking about, the changes that we need to be there. Right now, nobody's going to listen to us talking about the fact that there are grievances and there are issues that haven't been handled for the past 70 years. But if we talk about the democracy that there right now, Israel is in a crisis. Nobody is listening to anything else but the crisis. If we stand in this crisis, we're bringing ourselves into the picture and into the changes. And one more thing I would add is the fact that after the president of Israel made a reform of his own, something in the middle to try to put between both sides.
Okay.
He did not speak to the Arab political parties in the first draft that he did.
Okay.
And the Arab political parties criticized the fact that the president did not come and speak to them. But how will he speak to the Arab community if we do not say on the streets, we want change?
Okay. Let me get, I just want to give Sami 30 seconds for your final thoughts. Sami, go ahead.
Andrea, we really want to do a change. And we are really have been struggling all of our lives to do a serious change. But the serious problem is within the system. Without changing the system, the racist component, without dismantling the racist components of the Jewishness of the state, we cannot really do any serious change that we can really make a much better future for all of the people who are living within this part of the world. And the protesters, their vast majority, those who are also not part of the other political parties of the opposition, the independent individuals, are also fighting to go back to the racist situation that has been existing here for decades.
Sami, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to interrupt it there. We're actually over time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank both of you so much for being with us, and I'm sure we'll be speaking about this again in the near future. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.